It was an ordinary afternoon in a small diner tucked away on a quiet street. The kind of place where the air always smelled of fresh coffee, and the low hum of casual conversation blended with the soft clinking of cutlery. For Cassie, the young waitress with a warm smile and an easy laugh, it was just another shift. She had worked there for nearly 2 years, knew the regulars by name, and always made it a point to add a little extra kindness to her service. But that day, something happened that would change her life forever. Cassie had just finished refilling a customer's coffee when she noticed him, a man standing outside the large glass window. He looked rough around the edges, his clothes worn and layered against the autumn chill. His eyes darted between the menu board and the food being served to other customers. It was the kind of look Cassie had seen before, a quiet hunger mixed with hesitation, the silent battle of someone trying to muster the courage to step inside. Her heart ached as she watched him. He wasn't bothering anyone, just standing there, but the look on his face told a story of hard times. Cassie glanced over at her boss, Mr. Wallace, who was busy tallying receipts at the counter. She hesitated for a moment, knowing how he felt about anything, or anyone, that might disrupt his perfectly run business. The man finally stepped inside, the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. Heads turned briefly, but most of the customers quickly went back to their meals. He approached the counter with slow, deliberate steps, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. "Can I, just get a cup of coffee, please?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Cassie could see the desperation in his eyes. Before Mr. Wallace could look up, she stepped in with a quick nod. "I've got it," she said, grabbing a mug and pouring the coffee. She placed it in front of the man with a gentle smile. "Here you go, let me know if you need anything else." The man looked at her, his eyes welling up with gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured, wrapping his hands around the warm mug like it was a lifeline. Cassie didn't stop there. She quickly added a plate of scrambled eggs and toast to his table, hoping no one would notice. She didn't expect anything in return. She just couldn't stand the thought of someone going hungry while she had the means to help. But someone did notice. Mr. Wallace emerged from the back office, his sharp eyes zeroing in on the man and the untouched receipt pad on the counter. His face turned red as he realized what had happened. "Cassie," he called out, his voice cutting through the soft diner chatter like a blade. She turned, already bracing herself. "What do you think you're doing?" Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "He looked like he needed a meal," she said quietly. "That's not how this works," Mr. Wallace snapped, his voice rising. "We're running a business here, not a charity." "But it's just a plate of eggs," she argued, keeping her tone steady. "It's not like we're losing." "Enough," he barked, slamming a hand down on the counter. The entire diner fell silent. "If you want to feed every stray that walks in here, do it on your own time. But not here. You're fired." The words hit her like a slap. Fired? For helping someone? She stood frozen for a moment, a dozen emotions rushing through her: anger, shock, disbelief. The man at the table looked down, clearly ashamed, as if this was all somehow his fault. Cassie grabbed her apron and untied it slowly, her hands trembling. She looked at her boss one last time, but there was no point in arguing. Without a word, she turned and walked out the door. Standing in the crisp air outside, Cassie felt the weight of what had just happened. Her mind raced with worry. How would she pay her bills? What would her parents say? She tried to shake the thoughts away, focusing instead on the small comfort that at least the man inside had a warm meal in front of him. But then, just as she was about to leave, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and the man inside motioned for her to come closer. His suit was sharp, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Are you the one who was just fired?" Cassie hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Yes, that's me," she replied cautiously. The man nodded, his gaze intense. "Good. Then I think we need to talk." Cassie blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Talk about what?" she asked, her voice wary but polite. The man stepped out of the car, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement. He was tall and carried himself with an air of authority, like someone used to being in control of every situation. His dark eyes studied her for a moment before he spoke again. "About what just happened in there," he said, nodding toward the diner. "And about what kind of person you are." Her heart skipped a beat. Was he a lawyer, an investigator, or maybe even someone connected to Mr. Wallace? She had no idea, but something about his tone and the calm determination in his expression made her pause. "Look," she started, crossing her arms as a defense mechanism. "If this is about the guy inside, I was just trying to help. It wasn't about breaking rules or—" The man raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "Relax," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I'm not here to lecture you. Quite the opposite, actually." Cassie furrowed her brow, confused. "Then why are you here?" He leaned against the car, his posture casual but his words carrying weight. "I happened to be inside when it all went down," he said. "I saw what you did for that man, and I saw how you handled yourself afterward. Most people would have either ignored him or made a scene when things turned sour. But you didn't. You stood your ground and did what you thought was right, even when it cost you." Her cheeks flushed at his praise, though she wasn't sure why. "It didn't feel like much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was hungry. I couldn't not help." The man nodded, as if her words confirmed something he already believed. "And that's exactly the kind of person I'm looking for." Cassie blinked, her confusion growing. "Looking for? What do you mean?" He straightened up and extended his hand. "My name is Jonathan Reese," he said. "I run a foundation that helps people down on their luck, homeless individuals, families struggling to get by, anyone who needs a second chance. But the truth is, running a foundation like that takes more than money. It takes people who actually care. People like you." Cassie stared at him, stunned. I don't understand. Are you offering me a job or something?" "Not just a job," he said, his voice steady. "An opportunity to make a real difference. To do what you clearly already believe in." Her mind reeled. She'd gone from being fired to being offered some kind of role in a charity in less than half an hour. It felt surreal, like one of those stories you'd hear about but never think could happen to you. "But why me?" she asked, still skeptical. "You barely know anything about me." "I know enough," Jonathan said simply. "I saw the way you treated that man, with dignity and kindness, even when no one else did. That's not something you can fake. And if you can do that in a diner under pressure, I can only imagine what you're capable of with the right resources and support." Cassie looked down at her hands, still holding the crumpled apron she'd walked out with. Her instinct was to say no, to walk away and figure things out on her own. But something about Jonathan's words resonated with her. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as someone who had just lost her job, but as a person who could do something meaningful. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "This is all happening so fast. I don't even know if I'm qualified for something like that." Jonathan smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "You're more qualified than you think," he said. "But I won't push you. Here." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. "Take some time to think about it. Call me if you're interested. And if not, no hard feelings." Cassie took the card, her fingers brushing against the smooth texture. It felt heavy in her hand, not just because of what it represented but because of the decision it symbolized. As Jonathan got back into his car, he rolled down the window one last time. "Oh, and one more thing," he said, his voice carrying a hint of playfulness. "Don't sell yourself short, Cassie. Sometimes, life throws curveballs to see if you're ready for something bigger." With that, the car pulled away, leaving Cassie standing on the sidewalk, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She looked down at the card again, her eyes lingering on the embossed name and phone number. What had started as an ordinary shift had turned into something she never could have imagined. But as she stood there, the weight of the moment sinking in, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. Cassie stood there on the sidewalk long after the black car disappeared around the corner, the weight of the business card still pressing against her palm. She turned it over in her fingers, the simple, clean design catching the light. Jonathan Reese, it read in sharp lettering, followed by a phone number and a website address. Nothing flashy, but it carried an air of importance, as though the card itself hinted at the kind of world Jonathan belonged to. A world far removed from the worn-out booths and sticky counters of the diner. Her thoughts raced, questions piling on top of one another. Who was this man really? Why would someone like him care about what happened to her? And what exactly was this opportunity he was offering? It sounded too good to be true, but his words lingered in her mind. Cassie sighed and stuffed the card into her coat pocket, unsure what to think. The reality of her situation began to creep back in. The rent that was due in a week, the groceries she could barely afford, and now, no job to fall back on. She pulled her coat tighter against the chill and started walking home, the sound of her boots echoing faintly against the empty sidewalk. The apartment she shared with her younger sister, Mia, was just a few blocks away. It wasn't much, just a cramped one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a heater that only worked half the time, but it was theirs. Cassie had taken on the role of caregiver after their parents passed away in a car accident 5 years ago. At 19, she had barely been an adult herself, but she didn't have a choice. Mia was her responsibility, and Cassie had promised herself she'd do whatever it took to give her little sister a stable life. As she climbed the narrow stairs to their unit, Cassie tried to shake off the weight of the day. She needed to keep it together for Mia's sake. No point in worrying her over something that couldn't be fixed tonight. When she opened the door, the smell of microwavable macaroni and cheese greeted her. Mia was sitting cross-legged on the couch, her textbooks spread out in front of her. The sight made Cassie smile, even as the heaviness in her chest grew. Mia was only 16, but she was smart, driven, and full of dreams Cassie would do anything to support. "You're home late," Mia said, looking up with a frown. "What happened? Did your shift run over?" Cassie hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She didn't want to lie, but she wasn't ready to explain everything just yet. "Something like that," she said lightly, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. "How was school?" Mia didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Same old," she said, closing her textbook. "But guess what? I got an A on my history paper." Cassie's face lit up, genuine pride washing over her. "Mia, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." They spent the next few minutes talking about Mia's day, her teachers, and the upcoming school dance she wasn't sure she wanted to attend. Cassie listened, nodding and laughing at the right moments, but part of her mind was elsewhere, turning over everything that had happened at the diner. After Mia went to bed, Cassie sat alone in the small living room, the dim light from the kitchen casting long shadows across the walls. She pulled Jonathan's card from her pocket and stared at it again. The idea of calling him felt ridiculous. She didn't belong in his world. She was just a waitress, a former waitress, she reminded herself bitterly. Still, his words wouldn't leave her alone. "You stood your ground and did what you thought was right, even when it cost you." Was that really something special? To her, it just felt like common decency. Cassie leaned back on the couch, running a hand through her hair. Maybe it wasn't about whether or not she deserved the opportunity. Maybe it was about the fact that she couldn't afford to ignore it. The next morning, Cassie woke up early, her mind still buzzing with questions. She spent hours researching Jonathan Rees and his foundation online. What she found left her both impressed and overwhelmed. Jonathan wasn't just anyone. He was a highly respected philanthropist who had made a fortune in the tech industry before dedicating his life to giving back. His foundation, Second Chances, had helped countless people across the country, from funding homeless shelters to creating job training programs for those who had been overlooked by society. The more Cassie read, the more surreal it felt. Why would someone like Jonathan take an interest in her? What could she possibly bring to the table? By midday, she couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number on the card, her heart pounding with every ring. Jonathan Rees speaking, his voice came through the line, calm and composed as ever. Cassie hesitated for a moment before finding her voice. "Hi, this is Cassie. The waitress from yesterday." "Cassie," Jonathan said, his tone brightening. "I was hoping you'd call." "I'm not sure why I did," she admitted, her voice shaky. "But I guess I need to know, is this for real? Or was it just some kind of spur-of-the-moment thing?" "It's as real as it gets," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "I wouldn't have made the offer if I didn't mean it." Cassie bit her lip, her mind racing. "Okay, but what exactly are you offering? Because, to be honest, I'm not sure I'm cut out for anything fancy or important." Jonathan chuckled softly. "It's not about fancy titles or qualifications," he said. "It's about heart, and you've already proven you have that. Why don't we meet? I can explain everything in person and answer any questions you have." Cassie hesitated. Meeting him felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But she couldn't deny the small spark of curiosity and hope that his words ignited. "Okay," she said finally. "When and where?" Jonathan gave her the details, a small cafe downtown, later that afternoon. As Cassie hung up the phone, a knot of nerves formed in her stomach. What was she getting herself into? The hours dragged as she tried to focus on anything other than the meeting. When the time finally came, she found herself standing outside the cafe, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Jonathan was already there, seated at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood when he saw her, his smile warm and welcoming. "Cassie," he said, extending a hand. "Thanks for coming." She shook his hand, still feeling out of her depth. "I almost didn't," she admitted, sitting across from him. "Well, I'm glad you did," he said, gesturing for her to order something. Once the waiter left, Jonathan leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "I won't sugarcoat it," he began. "What I'm asking of you won't be easy. It's going to take effort, patience, and a willingness to step outside your comfort zone. But I promise you, it'll be worth it." Cassie's stomach churned with nerves, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Jonathan smiled, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. "I want you to help me run a new initiative," he said. "Something that bridges the gap between people who need help and the resources they don't know how to access. You'll be working directly with individuals, hearing their stories, and finding ways to make a difference. Think of it as being a guide, an advocate." Cassie stared at him, her mind spinning. It sounded incredible and terrifying. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. "I've never done anything like this before." "You've already started," Jonathan said simply. "Yesterday, in that diner, you showed exactly what it takes. Compassion, courage, and the ability to act when others don't. That's all you need. The rest, we can teach you." Cassie sat back, her thoughts a whirlwind. It was a chance to do something meaningful, to step into a world she'd never imagined for herself. But it was also a leap into the unknown. "I need some time to think about it," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," Jonathan replied, sliding another card across the table. "But don't overthink it, Cassie. Sometimes, the best decisions are the ones we make with our hearts." As she walked out of the cafe, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. Jonathan's words stayed with her, echoing in her mind. Was she ready to take the leap? Or would fear hold her back? Cassie spent the next few days teetering between excitement and fear. Jonathan's offer stayed at the forefront of her mind, interrupting even the most mundane moments. While grocery shopping, she found herself wondering how much a job like that could change not just her life, but Mia's too. At the same time, doubts loomed large. Could she handle it? What if she failed? Mia noticed the shift almost immediately. Cassie wasn't the type to be distracted or indecisive, but lately, she seemed distant, her thoughts far away even when they were in the same room. "Okay, spill it," Mia said one evening as they sat on the couch, their plates of reheated leftovers balanced precariously on their laps. "Spill what?" Cassie asked, pretending not to know what her sister meant. "Whatever's going on with you," Mia said, narrowing her eyes. "You've been acting weird for days. Did something happen at work? Or did something happen after work?" Cassie sighed, setting her plate down on the coffee table. She had been hoping to avoid this conversation, but there was no keeping secrets from Mia for long. "I got fired," she said quietly. Mia's eyes widened. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to worry," Cassie admitted. "It wasn't a big deal. She hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Cassie, you don't get fired for nothing," Mia said, crossing her arms. "What happened?" "I gave a homeless man a meal," Cassie said finally. "The boss didn't like that, so he fired me." Mia stared at her for a long moment, processing what she had just heard. "Wait, you got fired for being nice?" "Pretty much," Cassie said, her voice laced with frustration. "That's ridiculous," Mia exclaimed, her tone rising. "You didn't do anything wrong. If anything, you did the right thing." "Thanks for saying that," Cassie said with a small smile. "But it doesn't change the fact that I'm out of a job now. And things are already tight enough as it is." Mia softened, her expression turning from anger to concern. "What are we going to do?" Cassie hesitated again, this time debating whether to tell Mia about Jonathan. She wasn't sure if she was ready to explain everything, but she also didn't want her sister to worry unnecessarily. "There's something else," she said slowly. "After I got fired, this guy approached me. He saw what happened and offered me a job." Mia's eyebrows shot up. "What kind of job?" Cassie took a deep breath, trying to put her thoughts into words. "He runs a foundation that helps people, homeless people, families who are struggling, that sort of thing. He wants me to help with a new program he's starting." Mia tilted her head, her expression skeptical. And you're just now telling me this? Cassie, that sounds amazing. Why haven't you already said yes? Because I'm scared, Cassie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never done anything like this before, Mia. What if I mess it up? What if I can't handle it? Mia leaned forward, her gaze intense. Cassie, you've been handling hard stuff your whole life. You took care of me when no one else would. You kept us going when things felt impossible. If anyone can do this, it's you. Cassie felt a lump rise in her throat at her sister's words. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. Do you really think I can do it? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. I know you can, Mia said firmly. And honestly, I think you have to. This isn't just about you, Cassie. It's about the people you could help. The people who need someone like you to stand up for them. Cassie nodded slowly, letting Mia's words sink in. For so long, she had been so focused on surviving day to day that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the bigger picture. Maybe this wasn't just an opportunity for her, it was a chance to make a real difference. The next morning, Cassie picked up the phone and dialed Jonathan's number again. Cassie, he said, his tone warm and welcoming. I was hoping I'd hear from you. I've thought about it, she said, her voice steady. And I'm in. Good, Jonathan said, the satisfaction evident in his tone. I knew you would be. He gave her the details for her first day, a meeting at the foundation's headquarters. Downtown, Cassie spent the next 2 days preparing, both excited and terrified about what lay ahead. When the day finally arrived, she found herself standing outside a sleek glass building, her nerves threatening to get the better of her. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, the cool air of the lobby washing over her. Jonathan greeted her personally, his presence as commanding as ever. He introduced her to the team, people from all walks of life, each with their own reasons for being there. Cassie felt out of place at first, but the warmth and enthusiasm of the group quickly put her at ease. Over the next few hours, Jonathan walked her through the details of the initiative. It was ambitious, no doubt about it. The program aimed to provide immediate assistance to those in need while also addressing the root causes of their struggles. You'll be on the front lines, Jonathan explained, meeting people, hearing their stories, and figuring out how we can help. It won't always be easy, but it will always be worth it. Cassie nodded, her initial doubts giving way to a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she could see a path forward, one where she wasn't just scraping by, but actually making a difference. By the end of the day, Cassie was exhausted but energized. As she left the building, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. But as she walked home, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She frowned, opening the message. Asterisk. Not everyone wants you to succeed. Be careful who you trust. Cassie stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. Who had sent this? And what did it mean? The excitement of the day gave way to unease as she tucked her phone back into her pocket and continued walking, her mind racing with questions. Whatever she had just stepped into, it was already clear that this wasn't going to be simple. Cassie couldn't shake the text from her mind. Every step home felt heavier, weighed down by the creeping sense of unease. The message had been so cryptic, yet it carried an undeniable edge of warning. She had no idea who would send something like that, or why. By the time she reached her apartment, the excitement of her new role had been completely overshadowed. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Mia was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open and earbuds in, but she pulled them out the moment she saw Cassie's expression. What happened? Mia asked, concern etched on her face. Nothing, Cassie lied, forcing a smile as she slipped her phone into her pocket. Just a long first day. How was school? Mia studied her for a moment, clearly not convinced but choosing not to press. Same as always, but I made spaghetti. She gestured to a pot on the stove, the smell of tomato sauce wafting through the air. Cassie smiled, genuinely this time. You're the best, she said, ruffling Mia's hair as she walked past. She tried to push the text to the back of her mind as they ate dinner, focusing instead on Mia's stories about her classmates and the science fair project she was working on. But later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the words came rushing back. Asterisk. Not everyone wants you to succeed. Be careful who you trust. What did it mean? Was someone at the foundation unhappy about her joining? Or was it something more personal? Someone from her past, perhaps? The possibilities felt endless and unnerving. The next morning, Cassie decided she couldn't just ignore it. She opened her phone and stared at the number. It was unlisted, no name attached. She debated responding, but something about the message felt final, as if the sender didn't want to reply. Instead, she decided to focus on her work. Whatever the text meant, she couldn't let it derail her before she even got started. Her second day at the foundation was a whirlwind. Jonathan paired her with a mentor, a seasoned caseworker named Elena, to help her get acclimated. Elena was sharp and direct, with an easy laugh that put Cassie at ease almost immediately. "You'll learn fast in this job," Elena said as they drove to a nearby shelter. "Mostly because you have to. Things move quickly when you're dealing with people in crisis. But from what Jonathan's told me about you, I think you'll do just fine." Cassie smiled, though the weight of the compliment made her nervous. She didn't want to let anyone down, especially not Jonathan. At the shelter, Elena introduced Cassie to some of the residents and staff, explaining how they work together to connect people with resources like housing and job training. Cassie listened intently, taking in every detail. But as she moved through the space, meeting people and hearing their stories, she felt a growing sense of purpose. This was why she was here, to help, to make a difference. For the first time since Jonathan had approached her, she felt like maybe she really could do this. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but fulfilled. Elena dropped her off at her apartment with a promise to text her the next day's schedule, and Cassie trudged upstairs, eager for a hot shower and some sleep. As she reached her door, she noticed something out of place, a small envelope taped to the handle. Her heart sank as she pulled it off and opened it, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed out in bold, black letters. Asterisk. Stay in your lane, or you'll regret it. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. She looked around the hallway, but it was empty, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. She rushed inside, locking the door behind her and double-checking that the chain was secure. Her pulse was racing, her mind spinning. Who was doing this, and why? She paced the living room, clutching the note in one hand and her phone in the other. Should she call Jonathan, the police, or was this exactly what the sender wanted, to scare her into backing out? She sat down on the couch, her head in her hands. She thought about Mia, asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the growing tension Cassie was facing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just threatening her, they were threatening the life she was trying so hard to build. But as the fear settled into her bones, it was replaced by something else. Resolve. Whoever was trying to intimidate her didn't know her as well as they thought. Cassie had spent her entire life fighting for what she believed in, for the people she loved. She wasn't about to let a few threats scare her off. The next morning, she was at the foundation bright and early, her nerves hidden behind a determined smile. Jonathan greeted her in the lobby, his expression warm as always. "Ready for another day?" "Absolutely," Cassie said, her voice steady. But as the day went on, she couldn't help but keep her guard up, her eyes scanning for anything, or anyone, out of place. She didn't tell Jonathan or Elena about the note, not yet. She needed more answers first. By the time she got home that evening, she had decided on a plan. If whoever was behind the threats thought they could scare her into quitting, they were wrong. Cassie was going to prove to them, and to herself, that she belonged here. But as she lay in bed that night, her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before picking it up, her heart pounding. This time, the message was even shorter. Asterisk. You've been warned. Cassie stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. Whatever this is, asterisk, she thought, I'm not backing down. She didn't know who was behind the threats, but she did know one thing. She wasn't going to let them win. Cassie didn't sleep much that night. The cryptic texts and the note left her feeling more exposed than ever. Every creak in the apartment sounded louder, every shadow in the hallway seemed more sinister. But as dawn broke, bathing her small living room in pale light, her fear was joined by determination. She wasn't going to let someone scare her away from this opportunity, not after everything she'd been through to get here. The next day, she went to the foundation with a clear goal, to stay focused on her work and find out if anyone there might be connected to the threats. Jonathan greeted her with his usual charm, and Elena was as warm as ever, but Cassie couldn't help feeling like someone was watching her a little too closely. As the day unfolded, Cassie met with more individuals in need, their stories echoing in her mind long after the meetings were over. A single mother trying to escape an abusive relationship, An elderly man who had been evicted after a medical emergency drained his savings. A teenager who had aged out of the foster system and was now living on the streets. Each person she met reminded her why she had taken this leap in the first place. These were people who needed help, who needed someone to see them as more than just their circumstances. Cassie was determined to be that person, no matter how intimidating the obstacles seemed. But the threats weren't something she could ignore. By the third day, her paranoia began to grow. She started noticing little things. A hushed conversation that stopped when she entered a room. A staff member giving her a glance that lingered just a bit too long. Were these things real, or was her imagination running wild? Elena picked up on her unease during lunch. "You've been quiet today," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Is everything okay?" Cassie hesitated, unsure of how much to share. She wanted to trust Elena, but what if she was wrong? What if Elena was somehow involved? "I'm just trying to get the hang of everything," Cassie said finally. Forcing a smile, Elena studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It's a lot to take in at first. But you're doing great, Cassie. Don't be so hard on yourself." Cassie thanked her, but the conversation left her feeling even more conflicted. Elena seemed genuine, but so did Jonathan, and everyone else on the team, for that matter. Whoever was behind the threats was doing a good job of hiding it. That evening, as Cassie left the foundation, she decided to take a different route home. Her usual path felt too predictable, and the last thing she wanted was to make it easier for someone to track her. The streets were quieter than usual, the city lights casting long shadows. Cassie kept her pace steady, her eyes darting to every alley and corner. She tried to convince herself that she was being overly cautious, but deep down, she knew she couldn't take any chances. When she reached her apartment building, she felt a brief wave of relief. But as she stepped inside, she froze. A man was standing near the mailboxes, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. Cassie's heart raced as she quickly scanned his features. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. Was he someone from the foundation? Or was he just another tenant? The man glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he turned and walked out the door. Cassie's instincts screamed at her to follow him, but her legs wouldn't move. Instead, she stood frozen in place, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. When she finally made it upstairs, Mia was waiting for her with a plate of cookies and a proud grin. "Guess what?" Mia said, practically bouncing with excitement. "I got picked to present my science project to the whole school." Cassie forced a smile, pulling Mia into a hug. "That's amazing, Mia. I'm so proud of you." But even as she celebrated her sister's success, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the lobby. The following week at the foundation was a blur of meetings, paperwork, and late nights. Cassie threw herself into her work, hoping to drown out her fears. But the threats didn't stop. Another note appeared on her desk one morning. This one slipped into her bag when she wasn't looking. It read, "Asterisk, you're in over your head." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Whoever was doing this wasn't just watching her. They had access to her space, her things. She decided it was time to tell someone. After much deliberation, she approached Jonathan. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course," Jonathan said, ushering her into his office. Cassie closed the door behind her, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I've been getting these messages," she began, pulling out the notes and showing them to him. "And I don't know who's sending them, but they're starting to feel like more than just a prank." Jonathan's expression darkened as he read the notes. "Cassie, this is serious. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it," she admitted. "But now, I don't know what to do." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. "We'll figure this out," he said finally. "I'll talk to security and make sure they keep an eye out. In the meantime, if you notice anything, or anyone, suspicious, let me know immediately." Cassie nodded, grateful for his support but still feeling a lingering sense of unease. Whoever was behind the threats wasn't going to stop just because security was involved. That evening, as she walked home, she felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. But as she turned the corner onto her street, she noticed a figure standing near her building. It was the same man from the lobby, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. This time, Cassie didn't hesitate. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding as she approached him. But just as she got close, the man turned and disappeared into the crowd. Cassie stood there for a moment, her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but she was done being scared. Whoever he was, she was going to find out. And when she did, she was going to make sure he couldn't threaten her, or anyone else, again. Cassie couldn't stop replaying the image of the man in her mind as she made her way up to her apartment. His face, partially obscured by the brim of his cap, lingered like a shadow in her thoughts. Was he the one sending the notes? If so, why was he following her? And what was he trying to achieve? When she entered the apartment, Mia was sprawled out on the couch with her textbook, earbuds in as usual. Cassie was grateful her sister hadn't noticed her frazzled state. She didn't want Mia to worry. Cassie forced herself to calm down, taking slow, measured breaths as she double-checked the locks on the door. She spent the evening trying to focus on her work for the foundation, sifting through case files and jotting down notes for the next day. But her thoughts kept wandering back to the man. The growing tension was impossible to ignore, a weight pressing on her chest. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The sound made her jump, her pulse racing as she grabbed it. Another text, from the same unknown number. Asterisk. You don't know what you're getting into. Walk away. Cassie's hands trembled as she read the message. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, this was a direct warning. She quickly typed back, her anger outweighing her fear. Asterisk. Who are you? What do you want from me? The response came almost immediately. Asterisk. Stay out of it. Cassie stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Stay out of asterisk what? The next morning, she decided to confide in Elena. If anyone could help her make sense of this, it was her. They met at a coffee shop before heading to the foundation, and Cassie laid everything out, the notes, the texts, the man she kept seeing. Elena listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. This is bad, Cassie, Elena said, her voice low. Whoever this is, they clearly don't want you working at the foundation. Have you told Jonathan? I did, Cassie said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. He said he'd talk to security, but I don't think that's enough. This feels personal. Elena nodded thoughtfully. Do you think it could be connected to someone you've helped? Maybe someone who didn't want help, or felt like you were interfering. Cassie frowned, considering the possibility. She had encountered a few people who were resistant to assistance, but nothing that seemed threatening. I don't know, she admitted. But I can't just ignore it. If I back down now, they'll win. Elena reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Cassie's. You're braver than you give yourself credit for, she said. But you're also smart. Don't take unnecessary risks. If this escalates, you need to go to the police. Cassie nodded, grateful for Elena's support but still feeling uneasy. At the foundation later that day, Cassie decided to dig a little deeper. She went through old records, looking for anything that might hint at unresolved conflicts or people who had a grudge against the organization. As she scanned the files, a name caught her eye, Victor Kane. Victor had been a high-level donor to the foundation years ago, but his contributions had stopped abruptly after what appeared to be a falling out with Jonathan. There was no explanation in the files, but the name was circled in red ink, with the words, "Keep an eye on him," scribbled in the margins. Cassie's curiosity piqued. Was it possible Victor Kane was connected to the threats? She decided to bring it up with Jonathan. When she walked into his office later that afternoon, he looked up from his desk, his expression warm but tired. Cassie, he said, what's on your mind? I was going through some old files, she began cautiously, and I came across a name, Victor Kane. There's a note about him being someone to watch. Is he someone we should be worried about? Jonathan's expression shifted subtly, his usual calm demeanor giving way to something darker. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Victor Kane is complicated, he said finally. He was a major donor at one point, but we had a disagreement about the direction of the foundation. He wanted more control over how the money was spent, and when I pushed back, he pulled his funding. Things didn't end on good terms. Could he have something to do with the threats I've been getting? Cassie asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. Jonathan hesitated, then shook his head. I doubt it. Victor was always more interested in power and influence. He wouldn't waste his time on intimidation tactics. Cassie nodded, but something about Jonathan's response didn't sit right with her. He seemed too quick to dismiss the possibility, as if he didn't want her looking into it any further. As she left his office, her mind raced with questions. If Victor Kane wasn't behind the threats, then who was? And if he was involved, why was Jonathan so reluctant to consider it? That evening, as Cassie walked home, she felt a familiar chill run down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man in the baseball cap again. But the street was empty. When she reached her apartment, there was another envelope waiting for her, this time slipped under the door. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words inside. Asterisk. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Cassie sat down on the floor, clutching the note as a mix of fear and anger coursed through her. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her, they were trying to control her. But Cassie had spent her whole life fighting against people who tried to dictate her choices. She wasn't about to stop now. Cassie sat on the floor of her apartment for what felt like hours, staring at the note as if it would somehow reveal more than the stark threat it carried. The paper was plain, the words typed, no handwriting to analyze, no fingerprints to find. It was maddening. Every inch of her told her to call the police. But something held her back. If she didn't even know who was behind this, what could they do? The next morning, Cassie was at the foundation early, her mind still racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Kane was involved somehow, despite Jonathan's dismissive response. Maybe it wasn't him directly, but the timing of his fallout with the foundation and the eerie sense of something unresolved made him feel like a piece of the puzzle she couldn't ignore. Elena greeted her with a warm smile as they prepared for the day's outreach visits. You holding up okay? She asked. Cassie hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'm just trying to stay focused. But as they made their way through the city, visiting shelters and resource centers, Cassie couldn't help but feel distracted. Every time someone new entered a room, she found herself wondering if they were watching her, if they knew about the notes. The tension was exhausting. At their final stop of the day, Cassie stayed behind to organize some paperwork while Elena spoke with the staff. The small office was quiet, the hum of a printer the only sound. Cassie was about to pack up when a voice startled her. You're new here, right? Cassie turned to see an older man standing in the doorway, his face weathered but kind. He looked like he'd been through a lot. His clothes were clean but worn, his hands calloused. Yeah, Cassie said, setting down the file in her hands. I just started a few weeks ago. The man stepped inside, leaning slightly on the doorframe. This place, it's helped a lot of people, but not everyone likes what it stands for. Cassie's stomach tightened. What do you mean? The man shrugged, his gaze drifting to the window. When you start changing things, helping people who've been ignored, it stirs up trouble. Not everyone wants to see the system change. Cassie swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. Have you heard something? About me, or the foundation? The man looked at her then, his eyes sharp despite his tired demeanor. Just be careful, he said. People like you. They don't always see the danger until it's too late. Before Cassie could ask him anything else, Elena appeared in the doorway, a bright smile on her face. Ready to go? Cassie nodded, but her mind was spinning. As they left the shelter, she kept replaying the man's words. Who was he, and how did he know so much about the risks she was facing? That evening, Cassie sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open as she dug deeper into the foundation's history. She searched for any mention of Victor Kane, of past conflicts or controversies. Finally, she found something. A news article from 5 years ago mentioned Victor Kane's withdrawal of support, but it also hinted at something more, a lawsuit he had filed against the foundation, claiming mismanagement of funds. The case had been dismissed, but the details were vague. Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected. Was it possible Victor had never let go of his grudge? And if so, why target her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. She hesitated before picking it up, half expecting another cryptic message. But this time, it was a call. The number was blocked. Cassie's hand trembled as she answered. Hello? For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a distorted voice spoke. You've been warned. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. The line went dead. Cassie stared at the phone, her heart racing. This wasn't just about scaring her anymore. Someone was actively trying to silence her. The next day at the foundation, Cassie decided to confront Jonathan again. She walked into his office, her jaw set. We need to talk, she said, closing the door behind her. Jonathan looked up, his expression calm but wary. What's going on? Cassie placed the notes on his desk, along with a printout of the article about Victor Kane. I think someone is targeting me because of something in the foundation's past. And I think Victor Kane might be involved. Jonathan's expression darkened as he picked up the papers. Cassie, I told you before, Victor isn't the type to do something like this. Then who is? Cassie demanded. Because someone is going to a lot of trouble to make me quit, and I'm not just going to sit back and take it. Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I know this is scary, but I promise you, we'll figure it out. I'll talk to security again, and I'll reach out to some contacts. But you need to focus on your work and let me handle this. Cassie nodded reluctantly, but as she left his office, her frustration simmered. Jonathan's reassurances felt hollow. He was hiding something, she was sure of it. That night, as Cassie walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. She quickened her pace, her eyes darting to every shadow. When she reached her apartment, she found the door slightly ajar. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she pushed the door open, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone. The apartment was eerily quiet, every corner cloaked in darkness. Mia? She called out, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no response. Cassie's heart pounded as she stepped inside, her phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The living room was a mess, papers scattered, cushions overturned. Then she heard it, a faint sound coming from the bedroom. Her breath caught as she moved toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she pushed it open, her flashlight illuminated the figure standing by the window. It was the man in the baseball cap. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Cassie, he said, his voice calm but firm. We need to talk. Cassie froze, the beam from her phone's flashlight trembling as it illuminated the man's face. Up close, he looked older than she had imagined. His weathered skin and tired eyes seemed out of place with the tension in the room. He didn't move toward her, didn't seem hostile, just calm. What are you doing here? Cassie demanded, her voice low but firm. Her mind raced with questions and fear, though she tried to keep her composure. The man raised his hands slightly, palms open. I'm not here to hurt you, he said, but if you don't stop asking questions, things are going to get dangerous for both of us. Cassie didn't lower her flashlight. Who are you? Are you the one sending the notes? No, he said quickly, shaking his head. But I know who is. And trust me, you don't want to get involved with them. Cassie's pulse raced. She tried to make sense of his words, tried to decide if he was lying. Then why are you following me? Why are you in my apartment? The man glanced toward the window before looking back at her. Because you're not safe, he said. You've been digging into things you shouldn't. The people behind this, they don't care about the foundation, and they definitely don't care about you. All they care about is control, and right now, you're a threat. Cassie narrowed her eyes, her fear mingling with anger. If you're trying to scare me, it's not going to work. I'm not quitting. The man sighed, lowering his hands. It's not about scaring you, it's about saving you. You think this is just about some old grudge or money? It's bigger than that, and if you keep pushing, they're going to come after you and anyone close to you. Her stomach turned. The thought of Mia being dragged into this was unbearable, but she forced herself to stand her ground. Then tell me who they are. Tell me what I'm dealing with. The man hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Victor Kane isn't the one you need to worry about, he said finally. He's just a pawn, someone they use to keep their hands clean. The real people behind this, they've been manipulating the foundation for years. Skimming money, silencing anyone who gets too close to the truth. Cassie's grip on her phone tightened. Why should I believe you? The man took a step closer, his voice soft but urgent. Because if you don't, you're going to end up just like the others, threatened, discredited, or worse. Before Cassie could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Both of them froze. Did you tell anyone I was here? The man whispered, his voice sharp. Cassie shook her head, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The man moved quickly, pressing a finger to his lips as he motioned for her to stay quiet. Cassie barely had time to react before the door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, a tall man in a suit, his expression cold and calculating. Well, the newcomer said, his gaze flicking between Cassie and the man. Looks like I got here just in time. Cassie backed away, her mind scrambling for a plan. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay strong. The man in the suit smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Let's just say I work for people who like to keep things orderly. And you, Ms. Grant, have been causing quite a bit of disorder. The man in the baseball cap stepped between Cassie and the newcomer, his posture tense. She's not part of this, he said. Let her go. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to the intruder. You know as well as I do that she's already in too deep. And you, breaking into her apartment like this? It doesn't exactly inspire trust. Cassie's head spun. Wait, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. If you're here to keep me quiet, why not just do it already? Why all the warnings? The man in the suit's smile faded slightly. Because some problems can be solved without making a mess. You walk away, keep your mouth shut, and we can all go back to our lives. And if I don't? Cassie asked, her anger rising. His smile disappeared entirely. Then you'll learn the hard way what happens to people who don't listen. The man in the baseball cap turned to Cassie, his voice low. You need to go, now. Cassie hesitated, torn between her fear and her determination to see this through. I'm not running, she said firmly. The man in the suit sighed, as if disappointed. It's a shame. You're clearly smart, but you don't know when to stop. He reached into his pocket, and Cassie's heart nearly stopped. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a phone and tapped the screen a few times before holding it up. Cassie's blood ran cold as she saw the screen light up with a live feed of Mia, sitting on the couch in their apartment. Think carefully about your next move, the man said, his tone icy. Cassie's world seemed to tilt. The image of her sister, completely unaware of the danger she was in, brought everything into sharp focus. She had no choice now, not if it meant keeping Mia safe. But as the man in the baseball cap subtly shifted closer to her, his eyes met hers, and she realized he wasn't ready to give up yet. Neither was she. Cassie's heart thundered in her chest as she stared at the live feed of Mia on the man's phone. The image was crystal clear, a silent reminder that whoever these people were, they had resources far beyond what she could have imagined. What do you want from me? Cassie asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The man in the suit tilted his head slightly, as if amused by her question. It's simple. Stop asking questions, stop digging into things that don't concern you, and resign from the Foundation. Do that, and your sister stays safe. Refuse, and... He left the rest unsaid, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a noose. Cassie clenched her fists, her mind racing. She couldn't just walk away, not after everything she'd discovered. But she couldn't risk Mia's safety either. She glanced at the man in the baseball cap, who gave her a barely perceptible nod, as if to say he had a plan. I'll think about it, Cassie said finally, trying to buy herself time. The man in the suit smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Good, you have until tomorrow morning to decide. After that, I can't guarantee anything. With that, he turned and walked out, his polished shoes echoing in the hallway. The moment the door clicked shut, Cassie exhaled shakily and turned to the man in the baseball cap. Who are you? She demanded, her voice low but urgent. My name's Mark, he said quickly. I used to work for them, but I got out before things went too far. I've been keeping an eye on the Foundation ever since, trying to expose what they're doing. And now they're after me, Cassie said, her anger simmering just below the surface. Because I stumbled into their mess. Mark nodded. You're digging in places they've worked hard to cover up. That's why they're targeting you. But if we work together, we might be able to stop them. Cassie shook her head, frustration and fear boiling over. They just threatened my sister. I can't risk her life for this. Mark's expression softened. I know it's a lot to ask, but walking away won't keep you safe. Once they think you're a loose end, they'll come after you anyway. The only way out of this is to take them down. Cassie's mind whirled. Could she trust him? He had broken into her apartment, followed her for days, but he seemed genuine in his desire to help. Do you have proof? She asked finally. Something that connects them to the Foundation? Mark hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. This is everything I've been able to collect, he said. Financial records, communications, even some video evidence. It's not enough to bring them down on its own, but with your access to the Foundation, we might be able to fill in the gaps. Cassie stared at the drive, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. If what he was saying was true, she had the chance to expose something far bigger than she'd imagined. But if she was wrong, we don't have much time, Mark said, his voice cutting through her doubts. They're watching you closely now. If we're going to do this, we have to act fast. Cassie took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. Okay, she said, what's the plan? Mark gave her a small, grim smile. First, we need to get you somewhere safe. They'll probably send someone to keep an eye on you tonight. After that, we'll figure out how to get the rest of the evidence we need. Cassie nodded, her fear now mingling with a spark of determination. She grabbed a few essentials from her apartment, her laptop, some clothes, and a photo of Mia, before following Mark out into the night. As they slipped through the dimly lit streets, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound felt like a footstep behind them. Finally, Mark led her to an unassuming motel on the edge of town. We'll lay low here for now, he said, handing her a key. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next move. Cassie nodded, exhaustion beginning to set in. She stepped into the small, sparse room and locked the door behind her. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind raced with possibilities, her body tense with anticipation. Somewhere out there, Mia was still in danger, and the people responsible wouldn't stop until they had silenced her for good. As the hours ticked by, Cassie stared at the USB drive on the bedside table, the weight of the decision ahead pressing down on her. By morning, she would either find a way to expose the truth, or lose everything trying. Cassie lay awake in the motel bed, her mind a constant whirl of thoughts. The quiet hum of the air conditioner was the only sound breaking the silence, but it was a hollow noise, one that didn't bring any comfort. She kept picturing Mia, sitting innocently in their apartment, unaware of the danger that now loomed over her. The threat had felt distant before, like something she could control, but now it was real. Every moment she hesitated, every minute she spent figuring out the best move, was one more chance for the people behind this to strike. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly dawn. In a few hours, she'd have to make a decision. Was she ready to go all in on this? Could she truly trust Mark, a man who had shown up unannounced and barged into her life with little more than promises and cryptic warnings? The more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no turning back. She couldn't walk away and pretend everything would be fine. Cassie rose from the bed, her movements deliberate. The USB drive on the nightstand was still there, waiting for her to make a choice. She couldn't sit around and wait for a miracle. The only way to find out what was really going on with the Foundation, and to keep Mia safe, was to take the next step. The room was small, but Cassie felt like it was closing in on her. She grabbed her phone, quickly typing a message to Mia. I'm okay. I'll be home soon. Don't worry. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment longer, but she couldn't bring herself to explain. Mia had enough to worry about already, and she couldn't risk giving away her location, not with the people who were watching her. Cassie sent the message, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. Mark had said they'd need to move fast. The clock was ticking. Cassie stood up, quickly packing the few things she had taken from her apartment. She didn't even bother to fold her clothes neatly. They had to leave, and they had to do it now. She grabbed the USB drive, tucking it into her jacket pocket, and headed out of the motel room. Mark was already outside, leaning against a parked car. His face was shadowed by the early morning light, but his posture was rigid, tense. You ready? He asked, his eyes scanning the street behind her. Yeah, Cassie replied, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her chest. Let's do this. They got into the car, and Mark drove in silence for the first few minutes. Cassie felt the weight of every second passing, every turn they took toward what she hoped was the truth. Finally, Mark broke the silence. We're going to head to the server facility. It's the best place to extract the rest of the evidence we need. I've got access codes for one of the backup systems. Cassie nodded, though she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It all sounded so easy in theory, but nothing about this situation had been easy. She could only pray they wouldn't run into more trouble along the way. As they got closer to the facility, Cassie's anxiety grew. It was a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by industrial warehouses. There was a sense of isolation there, a quiet that made her feel even more exposed. Mark parked in a spot away from the main entrance. He turned to her, his face serious. We can't waste any time once we get inside. They'll be monitoring the system, but we should have a window of about 10 minutes to pull the files we need. Cassie took a deep breath. I'm in. But if anything goes wrong, Mark's eyes hardened. Nothing will go wrong. Just stay close, follow my lead. They both exited the car, moving toward the building with as much stealth as possible. Cassie's pulse thudded in her ears, each step feeling like it could be their last. The quiet hum of the city felt miles away. Mark led her to a side door, a plain metal entrance that didn't stand out, except for the keycard scanner next to it. He pulled a small device from his jacket pocket and attached it to the scanner. A soft beep echoed in the stillness, and the door clicked open. Cassie's heart raced as they slipped inside, the darkness of the corridor swallowing them whole. They moved quickly, their footsteps muted against the concrete floor. The air inside was cold, sterile. Mark paused in front of a door marked, "Server Room." He glanced at Cassie. "This is it. Once we're inside, you keep an eye on the hall while I grab the data." Cassie nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the USB drive in her pocket. The weight of it was heavier than it should have been, like it was a ticking bomb waiting to go off. Mark swiped his keycard again, and the door to the server room slid open. They slipped inside, and Cassie took her position by the door, her back pressed against the cold metal wall. She strained to listen for any sounds outside, footsteps, voices, anything that might indicate they weren't alone. Mark was already at the terminal, typing quickly, his eyes scanning the screen as the system came to life. He didn't look up as he spoke. "Give me a minute. Once I'm in, we'll start the extraction." Cassie's nerves were on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This was too easy, too quiet. They'd been in the building for less than 5 minutes, and she already felt like they were being set up. Then, as if her thoughts had conjured it, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. She motioned to Mark, but his back was to her, focused on the computer screen. The footsteps were growing louder. Whoever was coming was getting closer. Cassie's pulse quickened. There wasn't time. "Mark," she whispered urgently. He didn't respond. The door to the server room opened with a soft creak, and a shadow fell across the floor. Cassie's heart stopped. She wasn't alone anymore. Cassie's heart pounded as she pressed her back into the cold metal of the server room wall. The door creaked, just enough for her to hear the faint shuffle of footsteps from the hallway. It wasn't just anyone. She could tell by the rhythm of the steps. There was something deliberate, something professional in the way they moved. Mark was still at the terminal, his fingers flying over the keys as if he hadn't heard the approaching footsteps, his face fixed in concentration. Cassie's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of options. Should she warn him? Should she run? The second she moved, they'd both be exposed. The footsteps paused right outside the door. Cassie held her breath. She could see the shadow through the crack in the door. Whoever was out there was just waiting for them to slip up, and the last thing she wanted was for Mark to get caught with the data still downloading. But then, just as quickly as the footsteps had stopped, they moved again, receding down the hallway, as if the person had turned around and walked away. Cassie blinked, her mind trying to process the sudden change. Was it a guard? Had someone caught wind of them? Or had the person been distracted by something else? She strained to listen, but there was nothing. The building had returned to its eerie silence. "Mark," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "Someone's here." Mark didn't look up. "I know," he muttered under his breath. "Just give me a minute." Her stomach tightened. How did he know? Was this part of the plan? Without warning, the door swung open fully, and a figure stepped inside, a man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked on Cassie with cold intent. "You're in over your head, Ms. Grant," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. Cassie froze. This wasn't a security guard, not by the way he carried himself. It was someone higher up, someone with real power. The man's gaze flicked toward Mark, who hadn't budged from the terminal. "I assume this is the gentleman who's been helping you." Mark tensed but didn't turn around. He continued typing furiously, clearly not fazed by the intrusion. Cassie's mind reeled. Who was this guy? Why was he so sure of himself? The man stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the server racks as if he was looking for something specific. "I've been waiting for this moment," he continued, his voice almost disappointed. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? You don't know who you're messing with." Cassie's throat tightened. "Who are you?" The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Someone who's been keeping an eye on the Foundation for far longer than you." "I'm surprised it took you this long to find us." Mark finally looked up from the terminal, his face grim. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward the server racks, his fingers grazing the cables. It was as if he was savoring the moment. It's not about what I want. It's about what you've already done. You've unlocked a door that shouldn't have been opened, and now you're both going to pay for it. Cassie's mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about the Foundation anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. The man turned toward them, his gaze locking onto Cassie. You're here trying to expose a few bad apples. But the reality is, this is a well-oiled machine. You think you're uncovering corruption? What you're really doing is shaking the tree, and there's a whole lot more than a few rotten apples at the bottom. There's a whole orchard. Cassie's breath hitched. The weight of his words pressed down on her, making her feel small in the face of something so vast. The Foundation had been her focus, but what if it was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle? I don't know what you're talking about, Cassie said, her voice hoarse but determined. I'm here for the truth. The man laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. The truth? That's what you think you're after? Trust me, the truth you're after is dangerous. And if you keep pushing, you won't like what you find. Cassie glanced at Mark, who was now standing up, his body tense. His expression had shifted. There was something familiar in the way he was looking at the man. I warned you, Mark said, his voice low. Cassie turned toward him, confused. What do you mean? What's going on here? But before Mark could answer, the man in the suit took a step forward, his face now inches from Cassie's. You don't get to decide what the truth is. We do, and if you think you can just waltz in here and change everything, you're gravely mistaken. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a sleek black box with a single red button. Cassie's stomach dropped. What's that? She demanded. The man's smile was full of menace. A little insurance policy. Before she could react, he pressed the button. For a split second, everything in the room went dark. The monitors, the lights, even the hum of the building's power, all of it shut down in an instant. Cassie felt her pulse race as the air grew heavy with tension. And then the door to the server room slammed shut, plunging them into complete darkness. Cassie's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't see a thing. Just the faintest outlines of Mark and the man in the suit. What did you do? She whispered, her voice thick with fear. The man's voice came from somewhere in the dark, cold and final. I just ensured that you'll never see what's coming next. And as the darkness pressed in around her, Cassie realized just how much deeper the conspiracy went. Whoever these people were, they weren't just playing for control, they were playing for something far more dangerous. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Cassie's breath was the only sound she could hear, quick and shallow, as she tried to adjust to the overwhelming darkness. Her eyes were useless. Even though her pupils strained to see, there was no light to give her any sense of orientation. The man's presence still loomed in the air, though heavy and threatening. Mark, Cassie whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out blindly, hoping to find him. Her fingers brushed against something solid, his shoulder, she realized, and she grabbed onto him. What just happened? Stay calm, Mark's voice came, low and steady. He's activated a blackout, local control. He's trying to throw us off track. It's temporary. Cassie nodded even though she couldn't see him. Her mind was racing, the sense of urgency flooding her veins. What now? What do? We can't just sit here. We wait, Mark replied, his voice cool and collected. This won't last long, but when the lights come back on, we need to be ready. Cassie swallowed hard. The seconds dragged on in an agonizing crawl. She could feel Mark tense beside her, and she knew he was just as anxious as she was. The weight of the man's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk. You don't know what you're messing with. That line, that smug certainty in his voice, felt like a warning that carried far more weight than she had realized. Her thoughts spiraled. The Foundation, the documents on the USB, all of it had seemed like a puzzle she was just beginning to solve, but now it felt like she had stumbled into a much deeper abyss. Who were these people, and what was their real agenda? The blackout had only been a few moments, but it felt like an eternity. The silence stretched and stretched, until finally, with a soft buzz, the lights flickered back to life. Cassie blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden illumination. Mark's face was tense, but he was already moving toward the terminal again, his hands quickly tapping the keyboard. She followed him with her eyes, trying to piece together her next move. Suddenly, the door to the server room opened again with a sharp click asterisk, and Cassie felt her pulse spike. She wasn't alone anymore. The man in the suit stepped back into the room, his expression unreadable. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 more figures, tall and menacing, entered behind him, their eyes scanning the room with cold precision. One of them was holding a small tablet, the kind used to track security footage. His gaze flicked toward Mark, who was still hunched over the computer. The man in the suit didn't look at Cassie directly, but she could feel his eyes on her. He didn't need to say a word. The threat was implicit in his presence alone. "Mark," Cassie whispered again, but her voice felt small in the face of the growing tension. Mark didn't turn around. He kept his focus on the terminal, his fingers moving quickly. But Cassie could tell from the set of his shoulders that something was wrong. "We're not getting out of this as easily as I thought," he muttered under his breath. Cassie's heart sank. What did that mean? Without another word, the man in the suit motioned to the 2 figures behind him. The one with the tablet stepped forward, glancing at the screen before locking eyes with Mark. "You're not getting what you came for," he said flatly. "We've had eyes on you for days." Cassie's throat tightened. This wasn't just about the Foundation anymore. Someone had been watching them, watching her. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. The man in the suit didn't speak for a moment, letting the tension hang in the air. He seemed to be savoring the moment before he finally answered. "You've been asking the wrong questions. The truth you're after is more dangerous than you could ever imagine. It's already in motion, and you're far too late to stop it now." Cassie felt the weight of his words settle over her like a stone in her chest. What did he mean by that? What was already in motion? "You should have listened to me when you had the chance," the man continued, his voice colder now. "But it doesn't matter. You've crossed a line. There's no going back now." Cassie felt the sense of dread growing stronger with every word. It was like a fog, creeping up around her, making it harder to think clearly. Her fingers brushed the USB drive in her pocket once more, the small piece of plastic now feeling like the only thread that could tie all of this chaos together. Mark shifted, and for the first time, Cassie saw his eyes meet hers. There was something there, something unspoken. His lips moved, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned back to the terminal, his fingers tapping a new sequence of commands. The 2 figures standing behind the man in the suit exchanged a look, then moved toward Mark, seemingly aware of what he was doing. Cassie's breath caught. This was it. "Stop him," she shouted, but before the words even left her mouth, the man in the suit reached forward, pressing a button on the tablet the other figure was holding. Immediately, the hum of the server room grew louder, almost vibrating the floor beneath their feet. The screens flickered again, going black for a second before returning, but something had changed. Cassie's stomach dropped. The files, everything Mark had been trying to pull, were gone. Vanished. "Too late," the man in the suit said, his lips curling into a cold smile. "The data's been wiped. All your efforts have been for nothing." Cassie stood frozen, the air suddenly thick with realization. It was all slipping away. The evidence, the truth, everything they had fought for in the last few days. Then, something in the back of Cassie's mind clicked. The man's words. The data was gone, yes, but so was the USB drive. Had he known? Was that why he had threatened her so specifically? Had he anticipated everything? The lights flickered again, and this time, it wasn't just the power. Cassie's heart skipped a beat as she realized they were being moved. Someone had told them about the USB, and now it was too late to stop it. The weight of the moment hit Cassie like a ton of bricks. She could barely process what had just happened, the data wiped, the USB drive gone, and the eerie calm in the man's voice as he explained it all. Every step she'd taken in the last few days had led her here, and now she felt the crushing reality. They had anticipated her every move. She had been playing into their hands the entire time. The man in the suit seemed to take pleasure in the situation, his eyes flicking to the figures standing at the door, who were now blocking any escape route. "You don't understand, do you?" he asked, his tone mocking. "This isn't just about your little investigation. You've been poking around a far bigger problem than you're capable of solving." Cassie's mind raced. She could feel the panic creeping in, but she fought it down. She couldn't afford to lose control now. Her thoughts scrambled to find any possible way out of this mess. What had they done to the USB? Had they somehow tampered with it? Or was it even the same one? She had no idea, but she knew one thing for sure. There had to be another way to access the files. Mark had to have some backup, right? Mark was still at the terminal, his hands frozen over the keyboard. His face was pale, his expression strained. He was clearly struggling with the same realization. The air was thick with tension, and the seconds seemed to stretch impossibly long. Cassie took a step forward, her heart pounding. "You think you've won, but this isn't over. We will find the truth." Her voice was shaky, but defiant. The man's smile didn't falter. "The truth?" He shook his head, almost pitying her. "What you don't understand is that there is no truth you can find that isn't controlled by us. You're not looking at a conspiracy, Ms. Grant. You're looking at a system." His words were like a punch to the gut, but it was the final sentence that made Cassie's stomach twist. "And the system," he continued, "is already in motion." Cassie's blood ran cold. What did he mean by that? What was happening right now that she hadn't even seen coming? She had thought the Foundation was the source of the problem, but now it felt like there was something much deeper, something far more dangerous at play. The two men behind the suit-clad figure stepped forward, their presence like walls closing in. Cassie could feel the panic building again, the need to escape pushing her toward a rash decision, but she forced herself to stand still. Mark, she noticed, was still looking at the terminal, his hands hovering over the keyboard, his fingers twitching slightly, almost as if he were debating something. One of the men moved to the side, his hand sliding into his jacket. Cassie's eyes flicked to him in alarm, but it wasn't a weapon he pulled out. It was a small black envelope, the kind she'd seen on high-security files before. He walked over to the man in the suit, holding it out like it was some kind of sacred object. "Is this what you wanted, sir?" the man asked, his voice low. The suit-wearing figure didn't answer immediately. He reached for the envelope, his eyes flicking between Cassie and Mark before he took it, his face unreadable. He opened it slowly, as though savoring the moment, and pulled out a single piece of paper, the edges worn and frayed. He unfolded it with deliberate care, and his eyes scanned the contents. Cassie's heart skipped a beat. Was that the missing piece? The part of the puzzle she hadn't known was missing? The man's lips curled into a grim smile as he looked up from the document. "You have no idea what you've really uncovered, Ms. Grant. This isn't just a foundation. This is a front for something far more dangerous." He paused, letting the words settle before adding, "And now, we have you in our sights." Cassie's mind reeled. Her worst fears were becoming a reality. The Foundation wasn't just corrupt, it was the facade for something even darker. Something that had been hiding in plain sight, pulling strings and controlling the narrative. And she had unwittingly stumbled into the heart of it. But just as the weight of it all settled over her, Mark did something unexpected. He turned from the terminal, his expression intense. "I never said I was here to expose the Foundation," he said, his voice low and steady. Cassie blinked, confused. What was he talking about? Wasn't that exactly why they were here? What was going on? The man in the suit's eyes narrowed as Mark took a step forward, his stance more defensive now. "You're not a journalist, Cassie," Mark continued, his gaze fixed on the man in the suit. "At least, not anymore." He turned back to her, his eyes full of regret and something darker. "The truth isn't what you think." Cassie felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that Mark wasn't just a hacker or an ally. He had his own agenda, one that didn't involve exposing the Foundation. And now, she was caught in the middle of whatever plan he had set into motion. The man in the suit laughed softly, almost approvingly. Well, Mark. You were always the smarter one. I should have known you'd have a different plan. You see, Ms. Grant, this is the real game." He gestured toward Mark, as if confirming something that Cassie had only begun to understand. Her mind raced as she tried to process the new layer of betrayal. Mark had known more than he had let on. He wasn't just trying to help her, he had been playing his own part in a much bigger scheme. And Cassie had walked right into it. The man in the suit stepped forward, his tone shifting to one of finality. "Mark was never your ally, Ms. Grant. He's part of a much larger operation. And now, you're involved whether you want to be or not." Cassie's heart skipped a beat. "Mark, what is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice shaking. But before Mark could answer, the lights flickered once again. And this time, they didn't just flicker, they went out completely. The silence was deafening. Cassie's breath quickened as she realized they weren't just in the dark about the building's power. The truth, too, was slipping away, piece by piece, and she was no closer to finding it than she had been before. The darkness felt suffocating, almost tangible. Cassie's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed through her veins. Every nerve in her body was on edge, the silence hanging heavy like a veil, broken only by the soft, steady hum of the machines around her. The complete blackness made everything feel surreal, like time had stopped moving altogether. She could barely make out Mark's silhouette in the gloom. His figure stood still, unnervingly quiet, and for a split second, she thought she saw something in his posture, something distant, something cold. But then, the faintest glow flickered, a single monitor coming back to life, casting a dim, ghostly light across the room. It didn't last long, and in the brief moment it illuminated Mark's face, Cassie saw something that sent a shiver down her spine. Guilt. Not just any guilt, but the kind of guilt that came with deep, dark secrets. Mark, she breathed, barely able to hold back the tremor in her voice. What's happening? What do they want from us? He didn't answer immediately. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. She could hear his breath, sharp and quick. But there was no relief in his words when they came. We're too deep now, Cassie, he said, his voice low, almost resigned. I never wanted you to get dragged into this. You should have stayed away. Cassie's mind reeled. The truth had been slipping through her fingers for days, but now it felt like it had completely dissolved into nothingness. What do you mean? You knew what this was all along? I wasn't part of the plan at first, Mark admitted, his voice tight. But I got pulled in. You were right to look into the foundation. There's a lot of darkness there. But the people behind it, they're not just running a charity. They're controlling everything. I mean everything. The data, the system, it's all connected to something much bigger. And I thought I could expose it. He paused, his voice trembling with regret. But they found out about me. About us. I didn't want you involved, Cassie. I didn't want you to get hurt. Her breath caught. The realization crashed down on her. You weren't trying to help me at all, were you? You were using me. Mark's silence was answer enough. Cassie's world spun. The man in the suit's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk. The truth you're after is more dangerous than you could ever imagine. It's already in motion. She had always thought she was in control, chasing the truth she believed in. But now, the truth felt like a trap. It had always been a trap. The door opened again, breaking her spiraling thoughts. The light that poured in from the hallway revealed the two figures standing behind the man in the suit. Their shadows stretched out across the room like ominous sentinels. But something was different this time. The man in the suit, who had been the puppet master behind everything, stepped forward slowly, the weight of his calm gaze settling on Cassie like a heavy hand. You're too late, he said, his voice almost pitying. The plan is already in motion. The data is gone, the evidence destroyed. All of it was nothing but a diversion. A sick realization hit Cassie then. This wasn't just about hiding secrets or protecting power. This was about control over her, over everything. And now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, she understood that she had been used as a pawn in a game that she didn't even know was being played. I don't believe you, she spat, even though her voice shook. You think you can just make me forget everything? It's not over yet. But the man in the suit smiled, a slow, sinister smile. You're right, it's not over yet, but you're too caught up in your idealism to see it. He turned toward Mark, his expression changing, becoming more calculating. You failed, Mark, he said coldly. We can't afford any more mistakes. Cassie's heart stopped. Mark had failed? What had he done? What had they made him do? Mark stiffened. I did what I had to do. You didn't do it well enough, asterisk. The man sneered. Then he motioned toward one of the men who had been standing silently behind him. Without warning, the figure moved swiftly, grabbing Mark by the arm and forcing him toward the door. Mark struggled, but his resistance was weak, as though he had already given up. Cassie's pulse quickened, the urgency of the situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Stop, what are you doing? She cried, her voice breaking. But the man in the suit didn't respond. He simply watched her, an unreadable expression on his face. This is the end of your story, Ms. Grant. I hope you realize that. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Cassie alone in the room with only the hum of the machines for company. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the desk, her thoughts racing. Mark had failed, she had failed, and now, they were all trapped in a web of lies and deceit that she couldn't escape from. But then, just as her mind was beginning to spiral, something unexpected happened. The screen on the terminal flickered again. A new message appeared, this time not from the system or the man in the suit, but from someone else, someone unknown. The message was simple, a single line of text. Asterisk. It's not over. Keep going. Cassie stared at the screen, the words searing into her mind. It was a lifeline, a thread of hope in the chaos. The message wasn't from Mark, he was gone. And yet, someone else was reaching out to her. Without thinking, Cassie moved toward the terminal, her fingers trembling as she typed in a quick response. Who is this? The reply was almost immediate. You don't need to know my name. But you need to act fast. The people you're dealing with aren't what they seem, and they're already moving to cover their tracks. If you don't stop them, it will be too late. Everything you've uncovered is just the surface. The real game is much bigger. They're not just controlling the Foundation. They're controlling everything. Cassie's heart raced as she read the words. This was the break she had been waiting for. Whoever this person was, they had the information she needed to stop the men who had orchestrated everything. But it was clear now that there was no simple answer. The stakes were higher than she could have imagined, and the game she had walked into was far more dangerous than she could have ever prepared for. The screen went black again, the last message hanging in the air like a ghost. Cassie had no idea who was behind it or why they had decided to help her now, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. The pieces were scattered, but they weren't lost yet. As the lights flickered and the hum of the server room continued to echo in the background, Cassie knew that the fight wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about surviving long enough to expose the real enemy, before they could cover up everything. Cassie's breath came in short, sharp bursts as she stared at the screen. Her mind was racing, trying to process the words. Asterisk. The real game is much bigger. She didn't fully understand what that meant, but she felt the weight of it, like a threat that hung over her every thought. The room felt colder now, the darkness pressing in from every corner. She wasn't just a reporter anymore, digging for stories. She was a player in a dangerous game, and the rules were being rewritten with every step she took. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to remain calm. The first thing she needed to do was find out who was behind the message. Could it be someone else from the inside, someone who had seen through the lies? Or was it just another trap? She sat at the terminal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to type back, ask more questions, demand answers, but she knew that might alert the wrong people. She couldn't afford to be tracked. She had to be smarter than that. The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last. In the silence, Cassie felt the weight of everything pressing down on her, the mystery, the danger, the feeling of being trapped. But then, almost as if the universe had decided to give her a break, the door opened again. Her body went rigid, but it wasn't the suit-wearing man or the two goons from earlier. This time, it was Mark. His face was bruised, his eyes hollow, but he was there, standing in the doorway as if he had never left. Cassie. His voice was barely a whisper, but there was something in it, something urgent. We don't have much time. She sprang to her feet, her mind spinning. What happened? What do they want with you? Mark's eyes flicked to the hallway, as though expecting someone to walk in at any moment. I don't know exactly, but they're using me, Cassie. They've been using me all along. It was never about helping you. I thought I could outsmart them, play them at their own game, but... He broke off, his expression haunted. Cassie could see the deep regret in his eyes. I'm sorry. I never meant to pull you into this mess. She shook her head, the pieces clicking into place now, and though a part of her wanted to feel betrayed, she couldn't. She understood the desperation in Mark's eyes. He had been caught, just like her, in something far beyond their control. Why did you come back? She asked, her voice shaking. Mark hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder again, before stepping closer. Because they're coming for us. Not just me, not just you. They're coming for everything. The data, the Foundation, the whole damn operation. They're covering their tracks, Cassie. Wiping everything clean. Cassie's pulse quickened. What do we do? Mark's eyes locked onto hers, his face determined. We don't run, we fight. But the truth of those words hit her harder than any of the pain she'd felt so far. Fight. What could they do against such a massive force? She had no resources, no backup, nothing but her instincts, and they were telling her that the time for playing safe was over. She took a deep breath. Okay, but how? Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, a hard drive, sleek and black, barely noticeable. It's not much, but it's enough to expose everything, the Foundation, the system, everything that's been hidden. Cassie's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the key? The evidence she had been searching for? Mark handed her the drive, his eyes serious. You have to take it. It's the only way. The man in the suit, the people he's working with, they're already covering their tracks. But with this, we can stop them. She felt a weight in her hand as she took the drive, but with it came a sense of purpose. A spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still turn this around. And then, as quickly as Mark had appeared, he was gone again, slipping into the shadows just as the lights flickered once more. Cassie stood alone in the room, the drive burning a hole in her pocket. Her mind raced. The man in the suit had been right about one thing: time was running out. They couldn't waste any more of it. She needed to move, fast. The door to the hallway opened, and she froze, thinking it was the suit-clad man returning. But instead, it was the woman from the other day, the waitress who had served them at the cafe, the one who had been so kind to the homeless man. Cassie's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen her since the confrontation at the restaurant, and seeing her now was an unexpected twist. But the woman didn't look surprised to see Cassie. You're still here? Cassie asked, her voice tight. The woman nodded, a look of grim determination on her face. I've been watching. I know what you're trying to do, and I'm here to help. Cassie felt a rush of relief, mixed with confusion. How could she possibly know what was going on? How? Was all she could manage. Because I'm one of them, the woman said, her voice low. And I know exactly how deep this goes. Cassie's blood ran cold. One of them? The woman took a step closer, her gaze steady. But I'm not like them. I want to help you expose everything. The people behind all of this, they're dangerous. But I've got the resources you need. And the moment they realize what you have, they'll come for you. Cassie's mind raced. Another twist. A final turn in the road that she hadn't seen coming. She couldn't afford to trust easily, not anymore, but the urgency in the woman's voice was impossible to ignore. The game had escalated beyond anything she could have imagined, and now, more than ever, she needed to make a decision. Trust the woman and fight back, or risk losing everything. The tension was unbearable, but one thing was clear. The endgame had begun, and with the drive in her hand, Cassie was more determined than ever to bring the truth to light. But even as she prepared to make her next move, she couldn't shake the feeling that the biggest twist was still ahead of her, one final revelation that would change everything. Cassie stared at the woman, her thoughts racing like a swarm of bees trapped in a jar. How could she trust someone who had just admitted to being one of them? But there was something about the determination in the woman's eyes, something Cassie couldn't quite place. This was too important to ignore, too big to risk walking away from. Why should I believe you? Cassie demanded, her voice trembling but resolute. Her hand clutched the hard drive with white-knuckled intensity, feeling its weight almost like an anchor. The woman met Cassie's gaze, her expression unyielding. Because I'm here to help you. I've been trying to get inside, to take them down from the inside for months. But they're too powerful. They've got eyes and ears everywhere, even inside my own network. Cassie was unconvinced. I still don't understand. What do you want from me? The woman's brow furrowed, as though struggling with something. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice quiet and urgent. I want to help you find the truth. I know what's at stake. I know what they've been doing. And I know how to break through. But we don't have much time. Cassie watched as the woman opened her own bag, pulling out a series of gadgets and devices, little tools, almost like high-tech spy equipment. It was like something out of a movie, but Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that this was real. The world was spinning faster than she could keep up, but she knew she couldn't back down now. Okay, Cassie said, hesitantly. I'll hear you out, but I still want to know what you're really planning. The woman nodded, taking a deep breath. My name is Mia. I was part of their system, just like you and Mark. I thought I was doing something good, something right. But it turned out that the foundation wasn't just about charity or even helping people. It's something much darker. Mia's eyes flicked back to the hallway, then back to Cassie. They've been running the show behind the scenes. They control everything, the media, the politicians, the data, even the people who think they're in charge. Everything, and if we don't act fast, they'll cover their tracks for good. Cassie's heart sank as she listened. She had always been sure that she was just following a story, digging for the truth, yet now, she realized that she'd been fighting against something much bigger than she could have imagined. There were layers upon layers of lies, manipulation, and corruption, all hiding the true nature of what this foundation had become. Mia's voice was urgent. conveying the weight of her words. They've got too much power, Cassie. They've been infiltrating every sector, every system. They're even watching us right now. Cassie's skin prickled at the idea of surveillance, of being monitored at every moment. But Mia was right. They couldn't trust anyone. She looked at the hard drive in her hand, searching for answers, searching for a way out. The man in the suit's final words haunted her. Asterisk, it's not over. Keep going. You said you have resources? Cassie asked, her voice low but determined. Mia nodded, her expression grave. I do, and so do you. We just need to use what we have, think smarter than they do. We need to cut through their control, find the proof, and bring them down. Cassie hesitated. Mark's face flashed before her eyes, his desperate eyes, his unshakable sense of guilt. She couldn't just keep following clues. She had to find something more tangible, something solid that could really shake things up. Mia was moving fast now, pulling up information on her tablet, connecting the dots from Cassie's findings, her own sources, and a few new leads she'd just gotten from her network. The more Cassie watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a hunt for a story, it was a fight for freedom. For everyone. Listen, Mia said, pressing a few buttons on her tablet. We've got 3 major documents here, highly encrypted. These documents contain everything, the real data, the files, the secrets the Foundation has been hiding. But they're protected by a system so sophisticated, even the people inside haven't seen them. Cassie frowned, staring at the screen. And what do we do? How do we break through? Mia's eyes were focused, determined. First, we need to get you inside. You have the skills, the knowledge. They can't just block you out. We'll use the hard drive to upload a special access key. Once we've done that, we can get inside the system, retrieve the documents, and finally, make everything public. Cassie took a deep breath, knowing this was her only shot. Okay, let's do it. Mia's fingers flew over the screen, her actions precise and quick. Cassie watched, trying to memorize everything she could, not just for the sake of the mission but for her own sanity. This was a different world, one where everything was controlled, monitored, and manipulated. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, a burst of static from one of the terminals. Cassie looked up, her heart in her throat. She could see shadows moving in the hallway, figures approaching. The suit-wearing man and his team, looking as impassive and professional as ever. Their eyes were fixed on Cassie and Mia, assessing, waiting, like predators about to pounce. Mia didn't flinch. She continued to work, her movements unbroken, almost like she was too focused to care about the danger. Cassie's pulse hammered in her ears, every second dragging out like an eternity. We've got it, Mia finally said, a note of triumph in her voice. She turned the tablet screen to Cassie. There, on the screen, was a series of codes and data, almost incomprehensible to the naked eye, but Cassie could make out key terms, dates, names, locations, and amounts. This was the smoking gun, the proof they needed. Cassie's heart fluttered. She glanced at the approaching figures, her mind racing, trying to figure out what she could do next. It was time to take a stand, to fight back, to make sure this evidence didn't just disappear. But the man in the suit didn't stop, didn't react. He just kept coming, expression unreadable, eyes fixed on Cassie. And then, just as he was about to reach the door, Mia's voice cut through the air like a blade. Now. Cassie and Mia bolted for the exit. The alarms went off, lights flashing, the room vibrating with a deafening noise. The figures behind them scrambled, trying to catch up, but Cassie and Mia were moving too fast. They burst into the hallway, fighting their way through, with only one thing in their minds: getting out alive. Cassie clutched the hard drive to her chest, the evidence pressing against her skin like a lifeline. She knew they were just getting started, that the real battle was yet to come. But as she ran, she couldn't help but feel a sense of determination and hope. There was a chance, just a slim one, but it was enough to keep her going, to keep pushing for the truth. As the escape continued, Cassie realized something. This wasn't just about taking down the Foundation. It was about something much, much bigger. And with each step, she grew more certain that she wasn't going to stop until she'd uncovered every last secret. As Cassie and Mia made their way through the narrow, dimly lit corridors of the building, the tension seemed to build with every passing second. The sound of footsteps behind them echoed off the walls, growing closer and closer, the pressure mounting like a storm ready to break. Cassie's heart was racing, her breath shallow as she glanced over her shoulder, expecting the worst at every turn. But there was no turning back now. They were in too deep. Mia led the way, her pace unyielding, her focus sharp. She had done this before. Cassie could see it in the way she moved, confident and purposeful. But even Mia couldn't hide the urgency in her eyes. They had mere minutes before the whole place was on lockdown, and they would be trapped. Cassie's hand clutched the hard drive, feeling its weight like a bomb about to explode. It was everything they had worked for, everything that could take down the foundation once and for all. And yet, as they rounded the corner, Cassie felt a gnawing sense of doubt creeping in. What if they weren't prepared for what was coming? What if the information they'd just unlocked was more dangerous than they realized? "Where are we headed?" Cassie whispered, keeping her voice low, though her heart was pounding in her ears. Mia didn't answer immediately, her focus unwavering as she scanned the hallway ahead. "The exit's close," she said, her voice tight. "But we need to make sure we don't get caught. We've got one shot at this, Cassie. If we get stopped now, it's over." The reality of the situation hit Cassie with full force. This was no longer just about exposing the truth, it was about survival. And even though she had been in dangerous situations before, she had never felt the weight of it like this. If they were caught, they wouldn't just lose the data, they would lose everything. Their lives, their freedom, their chance to make any difference at all. They reached a locked door at the end of the hall, and Mia immediately went to work, pulling out a small device from her pocket and plugging it into the lock. Cassie stood watch, her senses on high alert. She could hear footsteps growing nearer, the sound of voices calling out in the distance. Come on, Mia muttered under her breath, her fingers moving quickly. Finally, the lock clicked open with a soft snap. Mia pushed the door open, and they slipped into the stairwell, the muffled sound of their footfalls barely audible as they descended. The building's security system was kicking in, alarms blaring, lights flashing. Cassie could feel her pulse thrumming in her neck as they moved down the stairs, each step echoing louder than the last. "There's a car waiting for us at the back entrance," Mia said, her voice low and steady. "Once we're out, we can get to a safe house. Then we can upload everything. Get it to the public." Cassie nodded, but there was a gnawing feeling in her gut. Things had been too easy so far. They hadn't run into anyone yet. And she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Something wasn't right. They reached the ground floor, and Cassie's instincts screamed at her to be careful. She could hear voices now, a flurry of activity just outside the door. People were searching, preparing to lock down the building. "We've got to move," Mia said, urging Cassie forward. They hurried through the back corridors, making their way toward the exit. Cassie could feel the sweat on her palms, the weight of the hard drive growing heavier by the second. Everything depended on what was inside that drive. But as they neared the exit, something unexpected happened. The door they had been heading toward, once their escape route, was now guarded. Two men stood in front of it, eyes scanning the hall, weapons slung over their shoulders. Cassie froze, her heart racing, her mind scrambling for a solution. Mia cursed under her breath, her hand gripping Cassie's arm tightly. "We've got to find another way." They turned quickly, darting down another hallway. But Cassie could hear the sounds of footsteps closing in from all directions. The building was being sealed, and it was clear they were running out of time. There was no way they could fight their way out of here. They needed to think fast. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Cassie whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "We need a plan. We can't just keep running." Mia's face was set in stone, her jaw clenched as she scanned the area around them. "I have a plan. But we have to act fast." Cassie didn't have time to ask any more questions. Mia was already pulling out another device, something more sophisticated than the lockpicking tool she'd used earlier. She tapped in a series of commands, and a small map of the building flickered to life on the screen. They were close, so close. "There's a maintenance exit on the east side," Mia said, her voice low but firm. "It's not monitored as closely. We can make it if we move fast enough." Cassie nodded, but she wasn't so sure anymore. She had a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach, like something was about to go terribly wrong. It was all too clean, too easy, too perfect. There had to be something they were missing. The sound of voices grew louder, and Cassie's heart skipped a beat. The men at the door were now on the move, and soon, they'd be right on top of them. "We don't have much time," Mia said, urgency lacing her tone. "We're getting out now." They sprinted down another hallway, turning sharply toward the maintenance exit. Mia was ahead, her face focused, but Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. She glanced back once more, just in time to see two figures step into the corridor behind them. One of them was the man in the suit. Cassie's blood ran cold. They had been played. The man in the suit knew where they were going. He had been watching them this whole time. Mia pushed forward, her pace quickening as she turned the corner and headed toward the door. But Cassie could feel it. This wasn't a narrow escape anymore. It was a race against time, and they were losing. "We need to move," Mia said, her voice urgent as she reached for the exit door. But as Mia's hand grasped the handle, a voice stopped them cold. A voice that sent a chill down Cassie's spine. "I wouldn't go through that door if I were you." Cassie turned slowly, her stomach sinking as the man in the suit stepped into view, flanked by two guards. His cold eyes locked onto hers. "We've been waiting for you." The trap had finally sprung. And Cassie knew, with bone-deep certainty, that this was just the beginning. The door Mia had been about to open now felt like a prison. Cassie could hear the heavy beat of her own heart as it pounded in her chest, drowning out everything else. Her breath was shallow, her mind spinning as the man in the suit moved closer, his every step calculated and deliberate. "You knew," Cassie whispered, her voice barely audible. The man's lips curled into a cold smile, though his eyes remained sharp, unreadable. "We knew everything, Cassie. You've been playing right into our hands from the very beginning." Mia stood motionless, her eyes flicking between Cassie and the man, her face tight with frustration but not fear. "This wasn't part of the plan," she said, her voice low but firm. "You never intended to let us leave, did you?" The man's gaze shifted to Mia, a flicker of something passing over his expression. "Plans change. People change. We adapt. You, of all people, should know that." Mia's hand hovered over her bag, her fingers twitching toward something Cassie couldn't see. But she made no move to act. She was calculating, weighing options, and Cassie could see that she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Cassie felt a sharp pang of dread in her stomach. This was it. She had fought so hard to get to this point, to find the truth, but now it felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. Shish. She had hoped for a clean break, an exit, an escape, something that would let them expose everything. But now, it seemed the odds were stacked against them. The man in the suit spoke again, his tone almost casual, like he was discussing the weather. "You've done a good job, Cassie. Really, but I can't let you walk away with that." He nodded toward the hard drive clutched tightly in her hands. "That's too dangerous for you to have." Cassie swallowed hard, glancing down at the small device. The weight of it had never felt heavier. She could feel her fingers trembling, her grip tightening instinctively. It wasn't just data, it was everything. The key to everything that could bring them down. But she knew that if she handed it over, everything she had done would be for nothing. Mark's sacrifice, the risks they had taken, the hours spent uncovering their secrets, it would all be lost. "Tell me what you want," Cassie said, her voice wavering just slightly. "You've got me, you've got her, but you're not taking this from me." The man raised an eyebrow, his smirk never faltering. "I don't need to take it from you, Cassie. I just need to make sure it never gets out." A sudden silence fell between them, thick with tension. Cassie could feel her pulse quickening. She looked at Mia again, searching for some kind of signal, some kind of plan they hadn't shared. Mia's eyes met hers, but there was no plan. Only a quiet, shared understanding that this wasn't going to be easy. Mia broke the silence. "You think this is over? That you've won? You have no idea what's coming for you." The man's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "I'm afraid you've overestimated yourself, Mia. And Cassie, you've underestimated us." Cassie could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just about getting out anymore. It was about survival. They were running out of time, options, and space. The odds were stacked against them, but she refused to back down. Not now, not after everything they had done. Before she could respond, a sharp sound cut through the air, a sudden burst of noise. Like an explosion of sound from a nearby speaker. The lights flickered and for a moment, everything went dark. The sound of alarms blared once again, but this time, they were different, more frantic, more urgent. Cassie froze. What was happening? The man in the suit cursed under his breath, his composure cracking for just a moment. "What is this?" Mia was already moving. Her hand was back in her bag, pulling out a small device that looked like a remote. She pressed a button, and the lights flickered back on, though everything felt more chaotic now, more uncertain. Mia turned to Cassie, her voice low but determined. "We don't have much time. I've triggered the emergency system. It's going to buy us a few minutes. But that's all we've got." Cassie's mind raced. The emergency system? What did that mean? She could feel the seconds slipping away, but she knew they had to act fast. Whatever Mia had done, it had thrown the system into disarray. Maybe this was their chance to escape. The man in the suit didn't seem to be as taken by surprise as Cassie had hoped. He moved with precision, signaling to his men, who started to move into position. It was clear now. This wasn't a simple standoff. This was a calculated move by an organization with too much power, and they had every intention of holding onto it. Cassie's pulse pounded in her ears as she heard the click of a gun being cocked in the background. "You've sealed your fate, Mia," the man said, his voice chillingly calm. "And yours too, Cassie." Everything felt like it was happening too fast. The walls seemed to close in, and every move they made felt like it was one step away from disaster. Then, without warning, Mia lunged forward, her movements swift and sharp. She tossed the small device toward the back of the room, and there was a sudden, deafening noise as the device emitted a bright flash of light. The room erupted into chaos. The lights flickered again, and a wave of confusion washed over everyone. Cassie didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, the hard drive still clutched tightly in her hand, and followed Mia as she dashed toward the exit, dodging the guards who were now blinded by the sudden flash. They pushed through the door, spilling into the cold night air. The world outside felt surreal, like they had just stepped out of a nightmare. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving. Their only hope was to make it to safety, whatever that meant now. Mia's voice was urgent as she grabbed Cassie's arm. "We've got to keep moving, Cassie. This isn't over." Cassie nodded, adrenaline surging through her veins. She could hear sirens in the distance, the sound of pursuit not far behind. But they had one last chance. They had one last shot at bringing the truth to light. And as they disappeared into the shadows of the night, Cassie knew that the fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The night air was cool against Cassie's skin as she and Mia sprinted through the alleyways, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. The sirens wailed in the distance, but they were fading, their path now veiled by the darkened streets. For a moment, Cassie dared to think that maybe, just maybe, they were safe. But she knew better. They had to keep moving. Mia's eyes were sharp, scanning the streets for any signs of trouble, but there was a glimmer of relief in her posture now that they had made it out of the building. She pulled Cassie into an abandoned car parked around the corner, its engine already running. The moment the door slammed shut, Mia pushed the car into gear, and they sped off, leaving behind the chaos and uncertainty that had been their world for so long. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Cassie allowed herself to breathe. The hard drive was still in her hand, its weight a constant reminder of everything they had fought for. The truth, the stakes, and the dangers that had followed them at every turn. Mia glanced at her, her face now a mask of quiet determination. "We've made it this far. But we've still got work to do." Cassie nodded, unable to speak at first. The weight of everything, the loss, the sacrifice, pressed down on her. "What now?" she finally asked. Mia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now, we get the data out. We have to expose everything. But we do it right. We do it carefully." The drive to their safe house felt like the longest one of Cassie's life. The city blurred by in a haze of lights and shadows, each passing street corner a reminder of how easily things could have gone wrong. But Mia had a plan. She always had a plan. Cassie just had to trust her. When they finally arrived, the house was quiet, nestled in a quiet neighborhood far from the city's chaos. They parked and slipped inside, the door shutting behind them with a quiet finality. The house was modest, a stark contrast to the luxury and danger they had just left behind. But it was a safe haven, and that's all that mattered. Inside, Mia immediately went to work. She set up a laptop, connected the hard drive, and began transferring the files. The hum of the machine was the only sound in the room, its whirring almost soothing in the stillness. Cassie sat across the room, watching Mia work, her mind still reeling from everything they had just escaped. After what felt like hours, Mia finally looked up, her expression tense. "It's done," she said, her voice hoarse. "It's all in the cloud now. There's no going back." Cassie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. The information they had risked everything for, the corruption, the lies, the cover-ups, was now out in the world. The people would know the truth, and nothing could stop it. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Cassie asked, her voice quiet, filled with doubt. Mia didn't immediately answer. She stared at the screen, as if searching for something more than just the words that appeared on it. After a moment, she spoke, her voice heavy with meaning. "It has to. People need to see this. They need to understand what's been happening behind closed doors." Cassie nodded, though she still felt the weight of uncertainty in her chest. The truth was now out there, but that didn't mean everything was over. It didn't mean that the fight was finished. There were still powerful people who would stop at nothing to bury it. But Mia was right. The truth was the first step. And now, it was in the hands of the people. As the hours passed, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even in the safety of their hidden refuge. Every creak of the floorboards, every passing shadow outside the window, made her jump. She had lived through the worst, but it seemed like danger was never far behind. It was like an invisible thread that connected everything, pulling her toward the inevitable. Still, she had to believe that it would all be worth it. The weight of everything they had endured would be justified once the story came to light, once the world saw the corruption for what it was. It wouldn't be easy, but the truth always had a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. The next morning, the world began to shift. News outlets around the globe began picking up the story. Investigative journalists dove in, analyzing the data they had worked so hard to uncover. And with each new headline, with each new revelation, Cassie felt a flicker of hope in her chest. But the battle was far from over. The people in power would fight back. They would do whatever it took to discredit the evidence, to make it disappear. Cassie knew that they weren't safe yet. Yet, there was something different in the air now. The world had woken up. People were demanding answers. Protests started in the streets, voices rising in unison. The truth, no matter how hard it was to swallow, was out there. Mia and Cassie kept moving, never staying in one place for too long, always one step ahead. The information they had released was powerful, but it had also made them targets. The people in charge would not let go of their power without a fight. But Cassie knew something now that she hadn't before. The fight was bigger than just them. It wasn't about one story, one person, or even one victory. It was about the collective. It was about every individual who had ever felt powerless and every voice that had ever been silenced. And as the sun began to set on another day, Cassie stood by the window, watching the world outside. She could hear the distant sound of a march, of people demanding accountability, of the world changing before her eyes. They had started something, and no matter what happened next, they had made sure that the truth would never be hidden again. Cassie knew they would never truly be safe. But in a way, that didn't matter anymore. The world was waking up, and they had ignited the spark. Now, it was up to everyone else to carry the flame. As she turned away from the window, Cassie caught Mia's eye. There was no need for words. They both knew that the road ahead was still dangerous, still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't just running, they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. As the days passed, the world's reaction to the revelations began to unfold in unexpected ways. The media frenzy was overwhelming at first. Every network, every journalist, had their eyes on the story. Governments, corporations, and the powerful figures behind the secrets they had uncovered scrambled to control the narrative. But it was too late. The truth had already taken root, and there was no way to erase the impact. Mia and Cassie stayed in constant motion, always a step ahead of those who sought to silence them. The threats began to pour in, anonymous phone calls, cryptic messages, veiled warnings, but they didn't flinch. They had come too far to back down now. The fight had changed from survival to something greater, something that resonated with every person who had ever felt the crushing weight of corruption, oppression, and lies. As the investigation grew, Cassie found herself becoming the face of the movement. The pressure was immense. Every interview, every public statement she made, came with the knowledge that it could all fall apart at any moment. But she held her ground. The people's voices, the ones who had long been ignored, were now being heard, and she wasn't about to let them down. One afternoon, a knock on the door interrupted their work. It was quiet, almost tentative. Cassie's heart skipped a beat. It was a risk, allowing anyone near them, but they couldn't keep hiding forever. Mia, ever the cautious one, peeked through the peephole before opening the door. A man stood on the other side, his face weathered, eyes tired but resolute. He was holding an envelope. Mia's hand instinctively moved to her side, where she kept her concealed weapon, but the man held his hands up in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." Cassie stepped forward, wary but curious. "Who are you?" The man's voice was steady. "I'm a journalist. Been working on the same story you've been. My sources were the same as yours, and I've been trying to get this out for years. But they've been covering it up, silencing anyone who tries. I think we can work together now. It's time to push back. The world needs more than what you've given them. I've got more information, things you haven't seen yet." He handed her the envelope, and Cassie hesitated for only a moment before taking it. Inside, there was a series of documents and another drive. Her eyes scanned the first page quickly. More damning evidence, more proof of the vast network of corruption they were up against. This wasn't just about one company or one politician anymore. This was systemic. It was global. Cassie exchanged a glance with Mia, who seemed to be evaluating the man, her sharp eyes studying his every movement. There was a silent understanding between them. They couldn't turn away from this now, not when they had come so far. This was their moment to make a real difference. To expose everything. To bring the people who had caused so much harm to justice. "All right," Cassie said, her voice steady despite the torrent of emotions crashing inside her. "We'll take it, but we're not doing this alone. We need every voice we can get. Every person who's been hurt by this. We're going to go all the way." The journalist nodded, his face lighting up with gratitude. "I've got people who can help. You won't be alone in this." And just like that, the stakes rose once again. The battle was no longer just about survival, it was about taking down an entire system. A system that had thrived on fear and silence for far too long. With the new information in hand, Cassie and Mia set out once again, this time with a broader network of allies. Journalists, activists, whistleblowers, they all came together, united by a single goal: justice. The momentum grew, the pressure on the powers that be intensified, and the truth spread like wildfire. As the story continued to unfold, Cassie saw the impact of their work reflected in the faces of ordinary people. Protests erupted worldwide, but they weren't just about anger or frustration. They were about hope, the kind of hope that comes from knowing the truth has a voice. And the kind of change that happens when people are no longer afraid to stand up. But even as the world moved toward change, the danger was never far. The threats grew more personal. Cassie received letters in the mail, strange phone calls in the middle of the night, and Mia's every move was scrutinized. They were being hunted, but they had a purpose now. And they would keep fighting, no matter what. The final breakthrough came when key figures who had long been untouchable were exposed in a series of explosive articles and interviews. Whistleblowers came forward with irrefutable evidence, their identities hidden for protection. But it was clear that the walls were closing in on those who had sought to control everything from the shadows. The system, once thought invincible, was crumbling. In the midst of it all, Cassie took a step back and reflected on everything that had led her here. From the small-time journalist trying to make a difference to the woman who had helped bring down an empire of corruption, she had come a long way. But she knew that none of this was just about her. It was about every single person who had been silenced, oppressed, or ignored. And even though there were still dangers ahead, still people who would stop at nothing to undo the progress, they had succeeded in one thing. They had sparked something that couldn't be undone. The people now had the power, and there was no going back. Cassie looked out the window of their safe house once again, her thoughts clearer than they had ever been. The world outside was still full of chaos, still in the process of changing, but the first steps had been taken. The light had broken through, and it wasn't going away. She turned to Mia, who was busy working on the next phase of their strategy. There was still more to do, but for now, they had made their mark. "It's worth it, isn't it?" Cassie said, her voice soft. Mia didn't look up but gave a small, knowing smile. Every fight is worth it when you're fighting for the right reasons. And for the first time, Cassie felt at peace with their journey. They had exposed the truth. They had taken the fight to the powers that had controlled everything. They had become a part of something much bigger than themselves. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. They had ignited a spark that would burn long after they were gone. Cassie sat back, her gaze lingering on the window as the world outside continued its slow transformation. She had witnessed so much, so many twists and turns, so many near misses and moments of sheer terror. But in the end, it wasn't just about surviving. It wasn't just about evading the dangers that followed them. It was about making a difference, about leaving behind a world that was just a little bit brighter, a little bit freer, than it had been before. Mia glanced over at her, as if sensing the quiet reflection. "You good?" she asked, her voice as steady as ever. Cassie smiled, though it wasn't a smile of happiness, more a smile of recognition, of knowing. "Yeah, I'm good. We did it. We actually did it." Mia nodded, her expression still guarded but with a faint glimmer of approval in her eyes. "We did, and we're not done yet. There's still work to be done, more people to wake up. But we've come further than I thought we ever would." The weight of their work would never really leave them. They had unearthed truths that people had buried for decades, but the ramifications of those truths, of everything they had fought for, were just beginning. The ripple effects of their efforts could be seen in the global outcry, in the way people began to question everything, in the way those in power were starting to falter. But no one could deny it. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. As they prepared to move once again, always staying one step ahead of those who might seek to undermine their progress, there was a shift in the air. A quiet confidence in their mission, knowing that they had helped awaken something that had been dormant for too long. The hard truth, the one that Cassie had come to accept, was that change was never easy, never quick. But it was possible, and they had been part of that change. No matter the dangers, no matter the personal sacrifices, it had all been worth it. Cassie stood up, looking at Mia one last time before they moved on. "Let's do it. We've got more work to finish." Mia nodded once, her face set, ready for whatever would come next. They had seen enough of the dark side of the world to know that things would never be perfect. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, for once, the scales were tipping toward the light. As they stepped out into the world once again, Cassie's heart beat with a quiet sense of purpose. The truth had been unleashed, and now there was no going back. They had opened the floodgates. The voices of the silenced had been heard, and the fight would continue. In the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The fight for truth, for justice, for those who could no longer speak for themselves. This was where their story would always begin and end.